601 Choice by Hydesgrain. Jason was not sure what Whis had done because he had been distracted for a short moment, but it was evident that the scene unfolding in front of him was dangerous. Not knowing what would happen if he were to be forced to enter the world bridge, Jason didn't want to risk his life to find it out. As such, he cursed once again, while fusing with Artemis to increase his strength drastically while exerting the floating sky technique to the highest proficiency he could. Following that, Jason circulated a large amount of mana through his body, increasing his strength further. Yet, everything was for naught against the suctioning force that was growing stronger by the second. What can I do? Jason thought while trying to evaluate the world bridge's dangers with a single glance. This was easier said than done, and the only positive point Jason was able to think of could be said to be the fact that the coordinates of the world bridge stayed the same. However, the only positive point might as well turn into the cause for his death if he were to be suctioned into the world bridge right now. The coordinates could lead him straight into a mountain, leaving him no room to breathe, let alone move. This would be his death sentence, and Jason could imagine thousands of similar scenarios of his painful death, which was the cause of his fear to heighten drastically. In the end, this was not even the worst, because even Whis was struggling to fight the strong pulling force that sucked anything and everything in its wake. At least, that was what Jason could see at the first glance, only to witness how Whis transformed into a ginormous dragon with a length of more than 100 meters. This was astonishing, but Jason couldn't care less about that right now. With a terrific roar that reverberated through the entire surrounding, Whis, the dragon in its true form, was able to gain enough strength to escape the world bridge's clutches. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said about Jason, as he sensed how the entire surrounding was void of mana, forcing the world bridge to utilize its last efforts to draw out more mana. Jason saw this as a chance for him to retreat further, only to sense that the suctioning force increased manifolds. The unstable world bridge was unable to procure the necessary energy it required to maintain itself, while Jason struggled to not be drawn into it. Time seemed to slow down, but Jason's mind turned blank as he released his entire Celestia aura and stigma at once, giving him a little bit more strength. By using every trace of mana left within his body, Jason released everything as blood oozed out of his pores. Through this, Jason perceived something familiar, as his mind entered the deepest part of his conscience. There, he could see the image of himself, in front of the helix representing his two bloodlines. Yet, there was a huge difference in both his image and the helix in front of him. The Celestia bloodline was glowing in a bright silver light and was releasing a faint divine aura. It was completely different to that of his father's and intertwined with a faint trace of a crimson color. At the same time, Jason's image had enlarged, releasing the divine aura, while a faint halo emerged behind him. The golden silverish aura had merged with the divine aura, only for Jason to realize one thing. I can unleash the Celestia bloodline again. However, the moment he thought this, Jason recalled the Soul Fraction's words, telling him that he shouldn't release more seals if it was not necessary because his body was not yet ready for the burden. Unleashing his Celestia aura was something he had already done once, and it destroyed several seals at once. As such, Jason had to make a decision right now, in a matter of seconds. Should he release his Celestia bloodline, tearing apart his body, similar to, but even more life-threatening than what he had done during the blood eclipse, or should he enter the world bridge, risking his life in the unknown? His first reaction was to unleash the Celestia bloodline, unsealing several minor threshold seals at once, but Jason refrained himself from doing it, thinking that his body wouldn't be able to cope with the aftermath. If I have to take a path of pain, and possibly also death, I'll take the one with the highest survival rate. With that thought in his mind, time seemed to return to its normal pace as Jason turned around to look at Whis. Smiling lightly, he gathered all the energy left within him, only to shout, "Let's meet on Tagran." The world bridge would soon cease to exist, but Whis was barely strong enough to keep himself from falling apart. If he were to move a single inch, he knew that his body would be pulled into the world bridge. However, upon hearing Jason, the young dragon couldn't help but grit his teeth as his mind was rattling. Should I jump after him, or report everything to my master? No. Liea will definitely punish me if I don't even try to help Jason. Fuck this shit. Roaring out, Whis ignored Jason's statement about meeting on Tagran, as he flapped his enormous wings to approach the world bridge that was clearly mutating, and an anomaly. Through the pulling force on him and the movement technique he had activated, Whis's speed increased drastically, and it was only a moment later that he was barely a few meters away from Jason. However, these few meters felt like an insurmountable distance to Whis as the world bridge that had gradually changed released two different forces at once. Jason, who was still using his entire strength to fight against the pulling force, didn't want to give up without having tried. There was a big difference between saving himself by unleashing the Celestia bloodline that would severely injure, if not kill him, and giving up on trying his best to escape the world bridge that was about to collapse any moment. Seeing that Whis wanted to rescue him made Jason happy, but it didn't help him escape the world bridge's grasp as its pulling force increased, drawing him into it. At the same time, Jason could barely perceive that Whis was being pushed back by something. In fact, this force was the world bridge that had suddenly reverted its force from pulling to pushing, the moment Jason had entered it, making it impossible for Whis to reach Jason, who was only smiling. Remember my words, we will meet again. Despite not being able to be confident about the words he was shouting, Jason felt like his entire life was changing in ways he had never expected. Only a moment later, the world bridge on Argos disappeared, releasing Whis from the pushing force as he was hurled straight through empty air. Fuck! Whis roared out, which reverberated in the surroundings, waking up every living being in vicinity. Mana, how the hell am I supposed to find him there? The world bridge might have led to a dead end too, how the hell could that even happen? I barely touched the world bridge with my aura. Chapter 602 Unknown by Hydesgrain. Jason's surroundings were veiled in darkness, which would normally generate fear in others. However, it gave Jason the time to calm down before he blurted out. What the hell just happened? He knew that he was alone, but that was not the issue because his entire body was drained of mana, making it impossible for him to see anything. His eyes were veiled as it was normally the case within world bridges, and Jason could barely sense his surroundings. Realizing that it was no different from the times he had used a world bridge before calmed him further. As such, Jason was able to start absorbing tiny traces of the surrounding mana before leading it to his Emperor Eyes. Through this, his Emperor Eye's natural protection was directly utilized and the veil around his eyes quickly dispersed. However, what he saw in front of him was an all too familiar scene, something he had seen multiple times whenever he used a world bridge. The surroundings were filled with the three cultivation energies, and millions of stars could be seen in the vast expanse of darkness. Jason had already found out that the stars were in fact other planets, stellar systems, and so on, but instead of being focused on that, he decided to revert his attention to the small planet he could see far in the distance. He felt a tug, as if he was being pulled towards exactly the same distant planet, only to figure out that his earlier assumption was completely wrong. The planet was by no means small, and the nearer Jason was pulled to it through the world bridge's pathway, the bigger it appeared to him. Just what kind of existence is this planet? In comparison to it, Argos is tiny. If the planet's size was not surprising enough, Jason was truly shocked the moment he sensed dense mana and other energies radiating from the planet. It made him smile lightly, only to remember that he was not sure what place exactly he would be dumped into. I hope I won't be flung deep in the ocean. I think, maybe, I will be thrown straight into a volcano, or suffocate by being thrown straight into nothing but stone. In the end, the world bridge he had been pulled into had been an anomaly, which Jason could by no means take lightly. Furthermore, not a single beast had emerged from the large world bridge, when it had been active on Argos. This could have many reasons, but Jason was not sure if any of the ones he had in his mind made sense. As such, he could only hope that the place he would be thrown into was not a dead end. A dead end would be the worst-case scenario, and Jason would rather fall into an active volcano or be thrown into a deep ocean because he would have, at least, a small chance to survive. Even if he had accepted the fact that he was forcefully pulled into the world bridge without Whis, who was much stronger than he was, Jason felt that fate was playing around with him. He knew that he could have escaped the world bridge's suction force by simply unsealing his Celestia bloodline, but consequently, he would have been severely injured while several seals on his bloodline would have been irreparably destroyed. Through this, his situation would only have worsened because his body had yet to get fully accustomed to the divine aura he had annexed and devoured. His body couldn't withstand the vast pressure of a true Celestia yet, and there had been countless times that it had been on the brink of being torn apart. It was only because of this that Jason had decided to choose to enter the world bridge without further unleashing his bloodline further even for a short moment. This could have been a mistake, but it was an instinctive decision Jason took, in the single second wherein he had to make his choice. Without complaining, Jason accepted his current situation. He was unable to change it, either way. As such, making the best out of the situation was the only option in front of him. Even if he was not sure if it was something one could do or not, Jason had to replenish his mana. Thus, he absorbed the surrounding mana, hoping that he wouldn't alter anything, or too much about the world bridge's final destination. However, it was necessary for Jason to fill his mana core to the brim as he wasn't sure what horrors would await him after he emerged from the world bridge. It was always better to be safe than sorry. At that moment, a shocking thought appeared in his mind. What if the place I emerge happens to be the territory of beasts with a higher cultivation base than the second threshold of the Prisma stage? Without a single beast at a lower cultivation stage. Shaking his head, Jason reminded himself that he shouldn't be a pessimist. Trying to think of a solution, he put himself in Wiss's shoes. Jason tried to imagine what the young dragon would have done, had he been in his place. It was likely that he was already on his way back to Tagran, but Jason couldn't know that for sure. He was not even sure how much time had passed since he had been pulled into the world bridge. With that thought in mind, he realized that Whis might already be back on Tagran, or still be on Argos. I think mana, was it, right? Either way, the planet's size is several times larger than Argos, and I'm not even sure if I can truly measure it only using my eyes. Even if Whis would be searching for me, how should he know where to start? Smiling dryly, Jason could only shake his head and absorb some of the surrounding mana until his mana core was filled to the brim. After that, he would have loved to start cultivating, but that was not possible right now. Jason knew that he had to be vigilant and fully prepared for the moment when he would emerge on the other side, and that was not possible while cultivating. Time seemed to pass extremely slowly, and the planet in front of him was still increasing in size. However, that only allowed Jason to make use of his Emperor eyes as he inserted a faint amount of mana into them, reinforcing his eyesight. Thanks to the enhanced eyesight, Jason was able to see more details about mana than before. Yet, at the same time, he noticed the direction in which the world bridge's pathway was leading him. The planet had many beautiful sceneries, and a spark of excitement ignited within Jason, only to die down the moment he saw the place he was likely to enter. If you force me into the world bridge, at least give me some nice scenery to look at, and not barren lands. Sighing deeply, Jason felt as if he had been betrayed by the world bridge. Chuckling to himself, he realized that it was a ridiculous thought which allowed him to get a hang of himself only a few seconds later. It is about time, he mumbled, turning serious as he told his 3 soul bonds to be ready to enter his mana core. Not knowing where he would land, all 3 of his soul bonds prepared themselves for the worst. Because of that, everyone was becoming tenser the closer they approached the vast planet called Mana. The most annoying thing, however, was that Jason's assumption about his final destination had been accurate, and the vast barren lands were dotted with green, blue, and brown spots denoting sparse vegetation and oases. As for the rest, it looked similar to mud but was more black than anything else, in addition to purple spots that didn't look welcoming either. The sight alone was already more than enough for Jason to be frustrated about, but he tried to remain calm as he focused on the moment his entire body shook as he was rapidly pulled through the end of the World Bridge's pathway. The moment he emerged somewhere, Jason and his soul bonds were ready. However, instead of springing up into action, he looked around and saw a glimpse of something thanks to the World Bridge's faint shining light it radiated, before it disappeared forever, leaving him in utter darkness. His feet touched solid ground, and Jason was able to breathe properly. However, what he saw through his mana eyes was still enough for him to be worried about. Just where the hell am I? Chapter 603 Massive by Hydesgrain. Through his Emperor eyes, he could basically see everything, which allowed Jason to understand that he was completely alone. At least his proximity was void of beasts, but because he couldn't fully rely on his Emperor eyes, Jason had to use Solaris Flame to better see the surroundings. The black glow was not perfect to see something, but the faint orange color within Solaris allowed him to see much more. Apparently, the lesser origin flame was still not completely devoured, but that played into Jason's cards right now. Despite the faint light, Jason found that it was not enough to see everything clearly. Because of that, he accessed his spatial ring, trying to take out a staff that was engraved with many runes, completely covering the metal's dark blue tone. However, Jason noticed that his entire body had suddenly become heavier and that he couldn't even move a single inch. Is that the gravitational force? He wondered while circulating mana through his body, to force himself to move slightly. It was difficult but easier than expected. The gravitational force is not as burdening as I expected from a planet several times larger than Argos. Just where did I land? Once he was able to move, Jason inserted a faint trace of mana into the staff he had taken out, while leading the faint black flame he had conjured, to its tip. No sooner had he done this, a bright shining light emerged. Jason could have also used a normal lamp, but with the staff in his hand, he could also attack and defend himself if the need arose. In fact, the staff was probably one of the strongest weapons at the Lick stage that Jason had procured from winning the bet inside the Colosseum. Despite having sold most items he had procured, he had kept the staff for himself because it had certain characteristics that were similar to a wand, only to be slightly different. However, this slight difference made it much easier to produce the staff than a common wand as long as one had the necessary knowledge. With a bright light that lit the surrounding, Jason was now sure that he was inside a cave. Adding what he could see through his Emperor eyes that were empowered with a vast amount of mana, it was easy to tell that the cave was deep under the surface, and not even a single living being was nearby. On one hand, this was annoying because he had to find a way to the surface, but on the other hand, Jason couldn't help but smile brightly. He was ignoring the fact that he had been forcefully pulled into the World Bridge because his mind was already somewhere else. Thankfully, I didn't destroy my body only to escape the World Bridge. Jason sighed in relief as he sensed the density, purity, and vast amount of mana in his surroundings. Even with his passive mana gathering technique active, he could easily replenish the mana he was using for his Emperor eyes right now. The broken world, let alone the mana vein in Syro City, were child's play against the mana he was sensing right now, which made Jason realize just how scarce the mana on Argos had been. As long as I can breathe, I'll be able to find a way out. There is enough food and water inside my spatial ring too, so I won't dehydrate or starve either. With that thought, Jason could only count a handful of disadvantages that his arrival in an unknown area on mana had brought forth. The surrounding beasts could be extremely strong, even stronger than Whis or anything Jason had ever seen in his short, yet adventurous life. While this put him in a high-risk state, he could only be glad that there was not a single beast around him for now. However, this reassuring thought actually made him wonder just why there was no beast in his surroundings. At the same time, his mind kept drifting to his meeting with the Chaos Dragon. He had too many questions to ask her. It was not even unlikely that she might have answers to the questions that had been haunting him, namely what kind of existence had sealed the Celestia bloodline while imprinting a fraction of its soul into his body. With that knowledge, Jason could start to search for the mysterious beast in order to find clues about his grandparents' location. Even if it was a little bit frustrating that this would have to wait, at least, Jason didn't have to waste time searching for Whis' master. He knew that the Chaos Dragon lived on Tagran. According to Whis, there should also be a world bridge on Mana leading to Tagran, which meant that there might be people who knew about the location of said world bridge. For now, his encounter with the Chaos Dragon was only postponed. He wasn't sure how long it would take before he finally met her, but that might not be a disadvantage either. The Chaos Dragon could have ill intentions about him, and with his low cultivation base and strength, it shouldn't be difficult to manipulate him. This was unlikely to be the case, but Jason was still of the opinion that it was much better to meet Whis' master later when he would be much stronger than now. With the surrounding mana, I should be able to liquefy several drops of mana every day. That's quite good. Even though his mana drops were unique, and required triple the amount of mana to be compressed in comparison to normal liquefied mana drops, Jason couldn't help but feel that his calculation may be a little bit off. The surrounding mana was rich in both quality and quantity on a level he had never felt before. As such, he couldn't clearly estimate how high his cultivation speed could increase. Maybe I should start learning a cultivation technique. Is it finally time? Jason had never required a cultivation technique because his mana absorption rate, as well as the liquefaction process, had been too fast and high for Argos mana scarcity to cope with. However, this seemed to have changed now, which made Jason believe that he should start skimming through his spatial ring and look for a neutral cultivation technique. There were many techniques Jason had, and he wanted to sell them if his funds were scarce, thus he stored almost all of them instead of burning them as he had previously planned. This was a lucky happenstance that made him smile. Nevertheless, Jason first had to figure out whether his current surroundings were safe or not. His memories about the untraceable drakes and the manaless poison were still clear as day in his mind, and he didn't want to face a near-death situation once again. As such, he walked through the large cavern hall in which he was mercilessly dumped by the world bridge while doing two things. The most important thing was to trace the energies in the surroundings and figure out if there were possible dangers from beings he could see with his Emperor eyes. After that, he observed everything he could see through the bright light that radiated from his staff. Through this, he could be assured that there were no dangers in the surrounding, yet, Jason couldn't help but sense another disadvantage he had yet to balance out. I should definitely search for ways to see in the darkness. Using Solaris's bright light would become more exhausting the stronger he grows. Holding the staff as a means to cast a bright light, while having a tool to attack and defend myself is not the best idea either. Despite this though, Jason's first solution was to search for a beast that had good eyesight and could see well in little to no light. He planned to find such a beast and bind it to his soul. However, Jason was not sure if he was ready to bind a new beast to his soul, and he had yet to find a beast that suited him as well. Sighing, he continued to investigate the cavern hall, only to notice that there was nothing special, except the high amount of different energies around him. Yet, at the same time, there was only a single tunnel leading somewhere, which caused Jason to frown. Is that really the only way out? Chapter 604 Maze by Hydesgrain. Even after walking through the cavern hall one more time with his senses sharpened, Jason could only find one way out of the hall. This was not exactly what he had been hoping for because the dangers in the tunnel or following cavern halls could be extremely high. Simply put, he was not confident to fight strong beasts because it was evident that his cultivation stage was low. There is no way that I will encounter beasts below the Prisma stage in an area that is overflowing with mana. Right now his surroundings were void of beasts, but that was bound to change quickly. This was because the world bridge he had emerged from had disappeared. Without the necessary knowledge about world bridges, Jason would have just started to cultivate, thinking that the cavern hall gave him the best opportunity to do exactly that. Everyone would think so, but not Jason, who knew for a fact that the world bridge's disappearance would cause a chain reaction, and in fact, led to the very thing he didn't want, attract beasts. The world bridge's disappearance was important because naturally generated world bridges were, in fact, the planet's reaction to their planetary core overflowing with energy. Whis had explained it to him several times, which was also the reason for him to destroy only a few world bridges instead of all. Argos might face a shortage of mana, but at the same time, its planetary core was overflowing with mana owing to the fact that adapting to the sudden mana awakening more than 3 centuries ago had been extremely difficult. As such, while the mana on Argos increased, the planetary core was adjusting to its own production speed of mana. In the end, it was unlikely for the planetary core to be able to cope with the sheer amount of mana right off the bat. It wouldn't happen even after thousands of years have passed either. Thus, naturally generated world bridges were created by worlds, preventing the planetary core from getting damaged due to the overflowing mana. At the same time, the naturally created world bridges and the mana that was required to maintain them made it possible for the planetary core to adjust to the generated mana that was consistently increasing until it reached its limit. Artificially created world bridges were a different matter altogether, and they could bring forth chaos to the 2 planets that were forcefully connected. This was exactly what had happened when his father had created a world bridge between the Elva race's origin planet and Argos, while forcefully holding it together, turning it into a permanent world bridge. In the end, artificial world bridges were not important to Jason right now, and it was more of the fact that the surrounding mana had increased in density, purity, and quantity owing to the disappearance of the world bridge he had emerged from. Jason knew that this would attract other beasts, and they were certainly much stronger than him. It was not a given that they would attack him for sure, but taking the risk of being eaten alive was not something Jason wanted to do right now. As such, while his sub-area was passively absorbing tremendous amounts of mana, Jason was inserting a large portion of the same into his Emperor eyes, increasing the ability to see energy streams around him. This made it much easier for him to enter the only cavern tunnel he could find. It led downwards, which was annoying, but considering that he was able to breathe inside the cave, there should be a way to the surface, somewhere. Carefully walking through the wide tunnel, while holding the dark blue staff that glowed brightly, Jason had to ignore Petri and Solaris' plea to let them emerge from the soul world. Only Artemis remained quiet because she didn't want to stay in places where she couldn't fly around whenever she wanted. The cave was too narrow, and the sky too far away for her. Even with his Emperor eyes, Jason was not sure how deep into the ground they were because the mana-intertwined soul was something he couldn't see through completely. Only extremely strong mana fluctuations could be sensed by Jason, which was, however, more than enough for now. I will have to adjust to the new mana flow a lot faster, otherwise, it could end in a disaster. Thus, while the sub-area in his mind was passively absorbing mana, Jason was doing the same actively, increasing the mana flow. At the same time, he released the entire capabilities of his stigma and aura, increasing his mana mastery tremendously. The Celestia race was simply more affine with mana and Jason made use of that as much as possible. Releasing his aura and stigma could attract other beasts, but without being able to see anything through his Emperor eyes gave him enough reassurance to think that it was fine to release everything. Only when he perceived mana fluctuations of strong beasts did Jason retract everything at once while concealing his mana core. Jason even cancelled his sub-area's passive mana absorption, once he saw the terrific dense energy fluctuations of a beast moving forward in his direction. What he perceived was already more than enough for him to tremble in fear, but instead of behaving like a coward, it would make much more sense to look for a way out of the tunnel. The first few beasts that passed him in the following hours didn't use the wide tunnel Jason was in. This was extremely beneficial, and it indicated that there were several more tunnels all around him. It could also mean that there were beasts like moles or earthworms digging their way inside, but that did not matter right now. What mattered was the obvious fact that he was still alive, and was about to reach the second cavern hall. Normally, he would have extinguished the bright light, but Jason knew that his current position was several hundred feet deeper than he had been before. As such, a bright light was likely to dazzle and scare other beasts, preventing them from approaching a being with extremely weak mana fluctuations. On the other hand, it could also prove to be counterproductive and anger the beasts, making them lunge at him for encroaching their territory. As such, Jason decided to dim down the light, so that he could still see the immediate surroundings. After stepping into the second cavern hall, the first thing Jason noticed was a pungent scent that swept through the entire hall. It was extremely foul and strong enough to make his eyes tear up. Because of that, Jason summoned Solaris Flame that turned into his mask after being forcefully shaped into a suitable form. Being able to breathe properly was already great and more than he could have hoped for in the second cavern hall that looked more like a dumpster than anything else. There was a small underground lake right in front of him, but instead of being blue, or having a light touch of green, it was dark green, purplish, with small air bubbles all over the surface of the lake. The moment the air bubbles burst open, hot steam was released, creating the pungent smell. At least, I now know what those weird energy ripples were, he thought while trying to rid of his annoyance. Scanning through the cavern hall with his emperor eyes, Jason perceived that there were several beasts inside the lake. However, their strength was something he could barely face, but he need not worry for now because they seemed to be sound asleep. After his emperor eyes had perceived everything, he took a detailed look at everything with his normal eyes. This took him a few hours as the second cavern hall was much larger than the first one. Nevertheless, Jason was quite glad because there were a total of 6 tunnels that led him to a different location, and at least one of them should lead towards the surface. Despite this, he now had to figure out the fastest way to either reach the surface or to further distance himself from the cavern hall he had emerged in while searching for a place without any beasts to cultivate. Chapter 605 Treasure Trove by Hydesgrain. Jason was not sure whether it would be better to enter the depths of the cave or to leave as soon as possible. Both decisions could bring doom to him, and each had their own advantages and disadvantages. As such, he could only look at the 6 tunnels, while using his emperor eyes to roughly gauge where they would lead to. In the end, Jason decided to let fate take its course and that he would simply enter the tunnels that had the weakest and fewest beasts of whom he could see the mana fluctuations. This could be a mistake, but avoiding death and ensuring his survival was the highest priority for Jason. It was obvious, and because of that, it didn't really matter whether he remained inside the cave or made his way to the surface as long as he was alive. Thus he slowly inched his way towards the narrow tunnel where he could perceive the weakest mana fluctuations and time seemed to drag for eternity. Once he thought that he was in a relatively secure location, Jason started to absorb mana from the surrounding once again. His mind was fully focused on his surroundings and the passive mana absorption which he used to slowly liquefy drops of mana. Doing so while walking around was arduous and took him more time than necessary, but Jason didn't really have much to do except observing the surroundings and slowly walking through the long tunnel, to begin with. Jason was not sure where the tunnel was leading him because there were times he seemed to be walking upstairs, only to walk downstairs once again. The number of beasts around him was low as well as their strength, but the surrounding mana was still extremely dense. It was only a little bit less compared to before, which caused Jason to wonder whether Whis had exaggerated with his statement about world bridges and their task to drain energy from the overflowing planetary core. However, there was a huge difference between Argos and Mana's situation, size, amount of mana, and even more importantly, the number and capacities of world bridges that should be much higher. Hence, sustaining a single permanent world bridge with the limit at the second Prisma stage should be nothing for Mana. As such, Jason realized that he had overestimated the severity of mana released by the now disappeared world bridge. With that thought in mind, Jason could only sigh. In the end, it wouldn't have changed much either because there had still been a few beasts that were attracted to the increasing mana. Thus, there hadn't been a real possibility for him to cultivate in the small cavern hall, to begin with. Because of that, Jason realized that the beasts below the surface were probably more sensitive to changes underground. Furthermore, the beasts underground were a lot faster than he had initially expected, which made him believe that it may be better to look for the surface. While doing so, he could cultivate once in a while because Jason had the premonition that it would take a while to find a way out of the maze-like cave. As long as I'm alive, not heavily injured, pursued, it should be fine. I guess. Jason's attempts to lift his mood worked only partially, but that was only for a short time as he remembered that the entire area he should be in was nothing but barren lands. Sighing deeply, Jason continued to walk through the stupendous long tunnel, awaiting the next cavern hall or signs of something that could cheer him up. It could be anything ranging from rare ores, signs of him coming closer to the surface, or a place where he could cultivate, to make use of the extremely dense amount of pure mana. Despite that, he was unfortunate enough to be forced to walk through the tunnel for the time required to liquefy 3 highly compressed drops of mana. During that time, Jason had begun to ignore the dangers of the beasts all around him as they didn't seem to mind him cultivating and left him on his own. He was only absorbing a small amount of mana in the surroundings passively, and only his Celestia aura seemed to be of tiny interest. As such, Jason had retracted his Celestia aura while his stigma was still fully unleashed. The outline of some beings with strong energy fluctuations he had seen were mostly that of extremely large beasts, and the majority of them were in fact centipedes, earthworms, and huge insects Jason wanted to avoid at all costs. Even if not all beasts were extremely strong in comparison to the amount of mana and other energies that swept through the area, their cultivation base was at the first threshold of the Prisma stage, or higher. Jason had only seen a few beasts at the lick stage, and the majority of them had been inside the poisonous underground lake. As such, he was definitely at the bottom of the food pyramid, even if he were to reveal his entire combat prowess. That thought was disturbing, but at the same time, it caused an unknown excitement to ignite within him. Right now, he was too weak and got ignored by those that had better things to do than killing an insignificant fry. Only if Jason was stronger, would others start minding if he were to enter their territory. The moment he had liquefied the 3rd drop of mana, Jason saw a bright light ahead of him. However, instead of being astonished, he had already been aware of this. His Emperor eyes had allowed Jason to see the bright glow of the mana currents radiating from all kinds of unmoving objects. It was truly a blessing that his Emperor eyes allowed him to see through the mana-enriched soil, otherwise, he would have many issues. The mana current was what he was seeing through his bare eyes right now, and he was only able to avoid being dazzled owing to the faint layer of mana he had covered his eyes with. Entering the 3rd cavern hall, Jason took a look around, which was only possible because everything was lit up. A bright light shone through the entire hall, turning the staff in his hand useless. It was different than he had expected, but incomparable to the first cavern hall in which he had emerged, let alone the second one with the smelly sea. Everything radiated elemental transmuted mana, and Jason was extremely familiar with the majority of objects that caused the phenomenon of multicolored mana streams that were all around the room. These mana streams were attracted by the suctioning force he released, but instead of absorbing the elemental transmuted streams of mana around him, Jason decided to block out everything. Artemis could devour everything, while Solaris could burn through the transmutation, forcefully neutralizing the transmuted mana. But that was not what he wanted right now, because his eyes were glued to the ores and crystals he could see all around him. High-grade elemental crystals. Oh. And ores releasing elemental mana currents too. Jason was not sure about the ores names, but that did not really matter because he knew that they were extremely valuable. At least, that was what his Emperor eyes told him, owing to the specific hue around items that allowed him to determine their quality. During the last few years, he had neglected this ability of his eyes because it had been less important. But seeing the bright hues around the elemental crystals and ores, Jason's eyes couldn't help but gleam brightly. The hue around the ores wasn't usually that interesting in comparison to the hue determining the potential of beasts. However, right now, this was different, because the ores were at least at the low prisma grade without a higher quality. This was something Jason could determine because there were certain ores without a hue, and even they were exceptional. Did I just find a treasure trove? Chapter 606 Cave of Elements by Hydesgrain. Jason was astonished about the sheer quantity and quality of the ores and crystal the third cavern hall harbored. However, it felt somewhat weird to him. Every single cavern hall had something unique about it, and none of them was the same. Even if that may happen coincidentally, Jason couldn't help but look at everything with doubtful eyes. I must have been inside this maze-like cave for at least 2 days, if not longer, but I have yet to face a beast head-on, let alone find a way out of the cave. Just where did I land? Despite the treasure trove he had just found, Jason couldn't really be happy about it. Rather than finding the elemental ores and crystals, he would be more pleased with a cavern tunnel that led him upwards. It was not even important to reach the surface right now, just a single sign of him making some headway would be enough for him. Unfortunately, that was easier said than done, and Jason began to take a look at the third cavern hall. He appraised everything and looked for other tunnels that may lead him somewhere else. As long as he was not at a dead end, it was already fine, and Jason could only hope against hope that he wouldn't be stuck there forever. That was not too much to ask for after having been forced to enter a world he didn't even want to be right now. Even if Mana had many world bridges with Argos, Jason would rather be somewhere else. In his opinion, every place with a society where he could procure information, without being forced to stay underground, was much better than this situation. At least, knowing a way out of the cave would be quite helpful. Jason was slowly noticing that his bad mood was further plummeting and that he had to do something against it. Because of that, he took Byakuya out of the soul world before inserting a little mana into it. Adjusting its length, he turned Byakuya into a broad dagger before he used it to dig out one of the high-quality crystals. After enveloping it with his mana, Jason took a proper look at it. Using his senses and Emperor eyes, he could perceive everything about it, which made him smile. At least I won't have to forge a new pickaxe for now, he thought before storing the crystal away. Then, he took a look at the elemental ores. Slowly, he inserted a large amount of mana into Byakuya, and it vibrated lightly. Making use of this, Jason cut out a small piece of one of the ores. With a few kilograms of the element ore in his hand, he repeated the same procedure as he had already done with the elemental crystal. Nodding to himself, he stored the ore away too. Reaffirmed about his earlier thought, he accessed his spatial ring to take out a pickaxe made out of green metal. It had multiple runes inscribed on the tip, and by inserting mana into the pickaxe he was holding, it glowed lightly. Using his physical strength, Jason first lifted the pickaxe over his head before he struck the element ore in front of him. Though he could pack a punch, it was impossible to destroy the ore with a single strike. However, he was happy to note that a large crack had appeared on it. If I can't cultivate properly, and I'm stuck in this stupid place, let me at least reap some benefits. Knowing that his situation was only temporary, Jason wanted to gain a fortune in order to make use of it once he encountered other beings. There had to be a society somewhere, and they would most certainly use currencies to trade with each other. Thus, he required something to barter with, in order to obtain what he might need in the future. Other than that, he could sell the high-ranked crystals and ores in order to earn the new currency. With that in mind, Jason started to mine, ignoring the fact that the high-ranked crystals were, in fact, materials at the Peaklick and low Prisma rank. They had been rare on Argos, but that was unlikely to be the case on Mana, where he had already perceived the outlines of horrifying beasts he wanted to avoid encountering at all costs. Despite the possibility of the crystals and ores not being rare, their quality would increase their worth, nonetheless. Furthermore, Jason had to release his stress and frustration right now. As such, he couldn't help but feel glad to have found the third cavern hall. However, what astonished Jason a little bit was the fact that it looked like the third cavern hall was the beginning of a new part of the cave. Through his Emperor eyes, he could see a total of 3 cavern tunnels, and all of them had the same element transmuted mana currents as well as the unmoving outlines of the transmutation process's origin. As such, the entire part of the cave he had entered was filled with elemental crystals and element ores. This was interesting to know, but also told him that there were no intelligent races that had harvested these materials. Not even beasts that normally devoured those crystals to cultivate could find them, which made Jason both happy and sad. After several hours of mining, Jason slumped to the ground with a faint smile on his face. Even if he was still frustrated, the tension weighing on him had subsided through the arduous physical task. His entire body felt sore, but it was a feeling that calmed him down. Not a single beast attacked me while I was mining, and the noises I made were by no means low. Does that mean the surrounding beasts simply don't care about me and what I do, or is there a different reason? Jason was not sure about the final answer, but that was not something he could influence either way. Because he hadn't been attacked even after the clang and clamor of his pickaxe that had echoed through the cavern hall, and in turn the entire cave, Jason decided to release the restriction on his soul world. Thus, only a moment later, Petri and Solaris appeared next to him. Petri was in one of the smaller forms he could take thanks to use Artemis' size-altering ability, while Solaris had taken a liking to use the miniature form of the golden-eyed black flame dragon. Smiling lightly when he felt their overjoyed emotions, the frustration within him slowly dispersed. Astonishingly enough, Artemis had also decided to leave the soul world. She had sensed Jason's joy and that the reasons for his happiness were Petri and Solaris. Thus, driven by jealousy, Artemis ignored her discomfort of narrow places as she squeezed herself on Jason's shoulder. Through this, she wanted to clearly show who Jason belonged to. Yet, contrary to her expectations that Petri and Solaris would accept this, they began to cling to Jason as well. In the end, Jason's shoulders were occupied by Solaris and Artemis, while Petri had coiled himself around his entire abdomen. I'm pretty sure that I can't continue mining like this, Jason thought with a faint smile on his face. He had to change his plan now, but that was not a problem because there was something else he had wanted to do. Chapter 607 Possessive by Hydesgrain. Jason hadn't been sure how safe the cave he was inside truly was. However, it had been possible for him to mine element ores and elemental crystals for several hours without a single passing beast minding what Jason was doing. As such, he was relieved and thought that he could actively cultivate for some time. Yet, before Jason could do that properly, he had to do something else which only became a necessity after his arrival on Manor. Jason had yet to read through a cultivation manual, and he wanted to choose one to cultivate with first. There was a wide variety of manuals inside his spatial rings. Most of them were something he received as a reward after winning the bet inside the Colosseum in Janor. Other than that, there was a large number of foreign race beings he had killed and deprived of their spatial ring during the Great Argos War. Thus their cultivation, body refining, and martial art technique manuals were still with him. A neutral cultivation technique would be the best. I can't afford to injure myself by practicing an element-oriented cultivation technique. After all, I have 2 repulsive affinities already. With that thought, Jason ignored the fire and ice cultivation techniques, which he could have used owing to the affinities he had. As for the techniques he didn't want to use or couldn't, they were simply left inside his spatial ring to collect dust. In the end, only a small batch of 3 cultivation techniques made it out of his spatial ring. Amongst them, one was at the Terra Advanced rank and the other 2 were Terra Intermediate rank cultivation techniques. Because of the ranking, it was obvious that Jason chose the Terra Advanced cultivation technique first, which he picked up without hesitation. While reading through it, Jason's eyes gleamed in interest, but it was only an hour later that he sighed deeply before throwing the cultivation technique back into the spatial ring. It really doesn't work, he sighed deeply, before frustration overcame him. What kind of bullshit is that? He sounded indignant as he read through the pages and repeated the words in his head. You cannot change the cultivation technique after practicing it one time. Slamming the technique on the ground, he muttered to himself. As if, I would want to permanently use a Terra Advanced technique. Taking a deep breath, he forced himself to calm down before he picked up the other two techniques. At least give me the chance to switch to a better cultivation technique in the future. Jason was not sure whether he had been unlucky with the Terra Advanced technique, or if it was common to be only able to cultivate with one cultivation technique. He hoped that this was not the case because it would be quite annoying otherwise. In the worst-case scenario, he would have to reject using a cultivation technique for the time being. Fortunately, the worst-case scenario didn't occur, and he simply discarded the second technique that warned him about being unable to change the technique after the first cultivation session. Disappointed with the first two techniques, he picked the last manual but found the first words in the introduction to be quite reassuring. The technique, Balance of the Universe, does not restrict the user in cultivating with other manuals. Happy about the last technique he had found, Jason decided to study the technique before starting to cultivate it. As such, several hours passed with Jason sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading intently, and it was only when his three soul bonds were annoyed at his ignorance that they started to pester him. Never in his life could he have thought that his own soul bonds would initiate an attack, throwing away the cultivation manual he was reading for the second time. What are you three doing? Jason shouted, only to realize that they were glaring at him. Sighing deeply, he stood up to pick the cultivation manual lying on the ground before he stored it away. If you guys are bored, let's go. Jason had already imprinted the most basic steps to cultivate using the Balance of the Universe cultivation technique. It was not exactly difficult, and neither did it require extreme focus. Rather, his mind had to tranquil any disturbing thoughts while his body would follow the motions detailed in the technique's descriptions. The movements sounded rather weird, and the pictures that demonstrated the movements were not better either. However, that was just his opinion, and it shouldn't matter how ridiculous he looked as long as it was possible for him to cultivate at a much faster pace. There were several types of cultivation poses, and amongst the best was to sit down and enter a meditative stance. Jason had often heard of such positions, like the lotus stance, but he never believed that it was truly necessary to enter such a position. Fortunately, I can cultivate while walking around. They would really kill me if I were to stay rooted to a spot like a statue, only to cultivate for days. Looking at Petri, who hissed at him in joy, while Solaris spit out small flames, only for Artemis to issue a faint squeal, Jason knew that his assumption was definitely correct. His soul bonds may look and act as if they were cute, but they were possessive, and each of them demanded Jason all for themselves. Maybe they will also attempt to assassinate me if I show signs of binding another beast to my soul. Somehow, Jason felt like the possibility for this to happen was not negligible, and even if they wouldn't really kill him, he assumed that his soul bonds would take revenge on him. That was if he would do something the three of them didn't like. Sighing deeply, Jason could only walk through the Cave of Elements, which was the name he had given to this part of the cave while choosing one of the 3 tunnels to walk through. Even if he had yet to find a way out, his mind had been calmed down due to his soul bond's interference, the stress relief mining crystals and ores gave him, in addition to the cultivation technique he was about to try testing out. Unfortunately, while testing how exactly the cultivation technique worked, he couldn't pay much attention to his surroundings. This mostly included his Emperor Eye's ability to see the energy flow of objects and other beings through the walls. As such, he told his soul bonds to act as his eyes and ears, which they reluctantly agreed to. In the end, Jason was their master, and their attacks on him had been more like pokes and pecks without any intent to hurt or kill him. If that were to be the case, the soul bond would severely injure them, and in the worst case, if their wrath towards Jason was overflowing, they might as well die owing to the continuous punishment they would receive over and over again. But that was extremely unlikely, even if a soul bond was treated badly. In mankind's history, this happened only a few times, and those soul bonds had been treated far worse than one would wish their worst enemy to be treated. Even if the incidents were numerous, Jason knew that he could trust his soul bonds with his life. There was nothing that could tear them apart, and both parties were fully aware of this, with the only issue being that Artemis and the rest knew that Jason would have to bind more soul bonds. This was unavoidable if they wanted Jason to become stronger, and it gave the 3 soul bonds even more reason to become as strong as possible, in the shortest amount of time. With that plan, Jason would need much longer before it was feasible for him to consider binding a new beast to his soul. Jason was completely oblivious to his soul bond's thoughts, and he simply focused on the cultivation manual with a faint smile on his lips. Chapter 608 Balance by Hydesgrain. In order to cultivate properly with the balance of the universe cultivation technique, Jason had to use a particular set of movements that changed the way he walked tremendously. Through this, his pores would open wider as long as Jason used a specific way to circulate mana through his body. After that was done, Jason could use the large amount of mana he absorbed to replace his own mana in order to circulate it in the same specific way through his mana veins. This was more difficult than he had expected, but this was only obvious. He was using a cultivation technique for the first time in his life and wanted to walk around while cultivating right off the bat. Difficulties were bound to happen because of that, but it made Jason excited. It had been quite some time since he had run into trouble mastering something because his capabilities had overwhelmed everyone around his age a long time ago. Argos had become the place he grew up, giving him the time to figure out who he was and what he wanted to achieve in the future. There were several things he had planned, but for everything, strength was a basic necessity. Several hours passed in which Jason was slowly adjusting himself to the sensation of cultivating with the balance of the universe cultivation technique. He had yet to make any remarkable progress, and his cultivation speed was currently several times slower than it was under normal circumstances, but that was not something Jason was concerned about. Slowly moving through the cave of elements in the described movements he was supposed to use, Jason felt that his suction force was fluctuating a lot. This meant that certain movements of his were easier to execute for him than others. Because of that, Jason couldn't help but wonder if the cultivation technique he practiced was also something he could use to stretch his body. There were several muscle groups he had to move which he'd never known to even exist earlier. This was extremely interesting, and Jason felt happy to have chosen the balance of the universe technique to cultivate. Using the vast majority of muscle groups, his body loosened up. However, at the same time, the unused muscles were quickly becoming sore because Jason forced himself to use them for several hours, which was only possible owing to his high physical condition. As such, after testing out the cultivation technique for quite some time, Jason stopped. That should be enough for today. Maybe I can practice more tomorrow, he mumbled to himself, only to shift his focus from using the cultivation technique to passively absorbing mana with the help of his mind's sub-area and his active efforts. There was no need to waste his precious time and halt to cultivate just because he couldn't use the cultivation technique right now. Looking around, Jason had no idea where he was, but thankfully he received a total of 3 transmitted thoughts and memories, given by his soul bonds. So I'm still in the tunnel and we walked upwards. That's great. Jason was quite happy due to the information shared by his soul bonds, and a faint smile emerged on his face. The tunnel was still leading upwards, and Jason felt as if he would be able to see the surface through his Emperor eyes soon. Even if he couldn't be sure what exactly he was seeing through his eyes, as long as he didn't see any outlines, it was possible to perceive a wide open space. This was because mana streams could move unhindered through the surrounding soil. As such, every single time he might see a wide open space through the Emperor eyes, it was either a gigantic cavern or the surface. Because of that, Jason was consistently inserting large amounts of mana into his eyes, enabling him to maintain a heightened eyesight. It allowed him to perceive specific objects and beasts through the mana-enriched soil. This sight was restricted to a radius of slightly more than 1 kilometer, but that should be more than enough. Right now, his eyes perceived nothing but beasts, elemental crystals, element ores, other kinds of ores, and another gigantic underground lake whose water molecules were similarly intertwined with mana. He had yet to see the surface or clues hinting at the fact that he was slowly approaching the surface, but that was not something that concerned Jason anymore. It was possible for him to walk through the cavern tunnels and halls without any issues, and had more than enough time to learn how to use a proper cultivation technique. Even if its grade was not high, that didn't concern Jason because his Celestia aura, stigma and innate mana mastery would boost the cultivation technique's speed to its limits. At least, he hoped that would happen once he had mastered the balance of the universe technique to some extent. Days passed and Jason felt like the tunnel was never ending. He had yet to perceive the surface too. This shocked him a little bit, and Jason was unable to determine just how deep underground he had been the whole time. Walking upwards for days, there should have at least been some clues about the surface, such as a simple gust of wind. However, there was nothing but the elemental crystals and element ores, which Jason had decided to mine a few hours every single day. He required a small fortune to barter or sell, to begin with, and mining cleared his mind and helped him keep negativity at bay. Nevertheless, Jason's entire body was sore, and instead of doing nothing, he had decided to practice the Netherworld's fort body refining technique once again. Solaris Flame soothed his sore muscles while the nutrition solutions he had obtained from the foreign race's spatial rings which he had killed during the Great Argos War revitalized him. The nutrition solutions were extremely helpful to refine his body, but also to provide it with energy. This allowed Jason to dull the ache of his sore muscles, only to continue testing the balance of the universe cultivation technique. He was slowly finding the perfect balance between using the described movements while circulating the absorbed mana through his body. Because of that, his cultivation speed was slowly increasing, brushing past the passive cultivation speed Jason could reach without the use of a cultivation technique. In the end, Jason didn't even sleep since the time he had emerged on mana because it was simply not necessary yet, and he wanted to see the first signs of the surface before he would even think of sleeping. Not wanting fatigue to consume him, he constantly replenished the energy that invigorated him consistently. Due to this, Jason felt as if he could stay awake for months. This was exactly what his premonition told him, that it would be necessary for him to stay awake for months before he would see the surface through the ground. Even if Jason hoped this to not be the case, it was almost as if the world bridge had brought him to the deepest possible part of the ginormous planet. Though he couldn't be sure of the fact, Jason knew that he would have long since reached the surface if he were to still be on Argos. More than 10 days had passed since his arrival on Mana and many things had changed. The most evident of all was that Jason and his soulbond's joy about the dense energy in the surroundings had dimmed down. Even Petri, who was able to feel the primordial energy in the surroundings, couldn't be happy about the current situation anymore. He wanted to return to his old size without being forced to enter the soul world. Unfortunately, this was easier said than done because the tunnel he was currently in was narrow and filled with spiked crystals at the Prisma grade. Those crystals were definitely sharp enough to pierce through Petri's tough scales, and Jason didn't want to see his youngest soulbond get injured needlessly. Meanwhile, Jason's only joy was that he'd earned quite a fortune and that his strength was slowly progressing through his own cultivation as well as that of his soulbonds. This was great, and even more so, because all three of his soulbonds were advancing with time, including Solaris, who wasn't restricted by the shackles that had held it down. Having absorbed the orange Lesser Origin flame crystal had made this possible for Solaris, and Jason was glad that he had stayed on Argos even more than before. Staying longer on Argos had helped him mature further, help those who were weaker than him, and he had even gained benefits from it. Chapter 609 Finally by Hydesgrain. Jason was ready to throw fists at any hostile being in his surroundings. Despite having earned a huge fortune, Jason felt the urge to let off some steam by fighting. His soulbond's strength had increased drastically and he had been able to cultivate properly too. Using the balance of the universe technique for half a day was no problem anymore, and the cultivation speed was several times higher than actively cultivating without a technique. This included the ability to cultivate extremely fast while walking around. Having imprinted the necessary movements into his mind, Jason was able to liquefy 5 drops of mana per day, while being able to continue walking around at the same time. And this excluded the enhancement received from releasing the Celestia aura. Jason could still improve his cultivation speed, but he was already shocked about the fast progress he had made. But that was only logical because his progress was the only thing that kept Jason from going insane. 3 more weeks had passed and he had already been underground for longer than a month, and he had yet to see signs of the surface. After walking upwards for almost 2 weeks, he had entered a small cavern hall, with several tunnels leading in all kinds of directions. Taking the tunnel that led upwards, Jason noticed too late that he had been deceived by his own senses as the tunnel was slowly turning flat, and stayed on the same level for the next weeks. Artemis, Petri, and Solaris were also slowly starting to be annoyed at the surroundings that looked exactly the same since the last few weeks, with Artemis being the noisiest about their circumstances. She was able to absorb the transmuted mana in the surrounding without any issues, but that didn't make anything better for her because the area around her restricted the little owl tremendously. She felt claustrophobic in the underground cave and missed flying in the sky, soaring through the heights in the open. Despite that, she had been diligently liquefying her mana, allowing her to create her 1,900th drops of mana without any issues. Her cultivation speed was even faster than Jason's, which was still somewhat restricted owing to the fact that the vast majority of mana in his surroundings was transmuted. Meanwhile, Petri had been able to learn to absorb primordial energy instead of life force, which was a new experience for the basilisk. It was interesting, but only for a few initial weeks. Doing the same week after week, for more than 10 hours a day was depressing, and Petri was eager to fight someone, using his normal form. Nevertheless, he had been able to compress his 4th drop of life force, which was equivalent to having 4,000 drops of liquefied mana, with the sole focus on enhancing the physique. Solaris' tasks were different compared to the other 2 soulbonds because it had to properly annex one of Jason's soul crystals first. Devouring the lesser origin flame had been less of a problem than Jason had initially expected, but that was definitely an advantage. Thanks to the second origin flame it had absorbed, Solaris had not only broken through its shackles, but it had also been possible for it to enhance its abilities. Despite not gaining a new ability, it didn't create any major issue as long as the existing abilities would be strengthened. After Solaris had finally annexed one of Jason's soul crystals, it had begun to use tiny traces of Jason's mana in addition to the fire-transmuted mana in the surroundings to absorb it into its mana core. With the absorbed mana, Solaris wanted to create its first solidified prismarine crystal. In the end, Jason couldn't complain about his own, let alone his soulbond's progress, because he would earn a huge fortune by selling the elemental crystals and element ores at the peak lick and low prismar grade that he had mined from the cave. Doing so for several hours a day slowly filled his spatial rings, and Jason also knew that it wouldn't take long before they would overflow. Never could he have imagined that this could happen, yet, his spatial rings were already filled to the brim. Without being able to calm himself by letting off steam through mining, Jason was not sure how long he could control himself anymore. He was very impatient since the beginning, and there was no way that he could stay underground for a few more months. Why did I even question myself whether I should cultivate underground or search for a way to the surface when I just entered mana? Jason knew if he had stayed even deeper underground to cultivate for a few months, he would have turned insane just by looking for a way out. Now that a month had passed, he was already at his wits' end, but there was a ray of hope Jason perceived. This ray of hope was in fact the 5th cavern hall he found, and one particular tunnel that had an extremely steep ascent. Driven by his impatience, Jason had told his soul bonds to return to the soul world. They could be injured if he was not careful, because Jason wanted to use Solaris flames to manifest wings on his back with which he wanted to fly up the steep tunnel. It could be a trap, but even his Emperor eyes clearly showed that the tunnel would go almost straight upwards for as far as he could see through the soil. As such, Jason became a little bit excited, feeling that he would soon reach the surface, which made his hands itch to touch the surface. With Solaris flames spurting out of his shoulder blades, Jason flew up the tunnel, precisely evading the long crystals that protruded out of the walls. His bright golden silverish eyes radiated a distinct glow in the same color, seeing everything more than a kilometer ahead of him as he continued to fly higher. This caused a bright smile to emerge on Jason's face because the tunnel he was flying up didn't suddenly twist in a random direction. It felt as if he was slowly being rescued, and he could tell that it wouldn't be long before he would reach the surface. At least, that was the only thing that made sense to Jason, because he knew that he had already traveled several kilometers in height just in the last few weeks. As such, considering the fast pace at which he ascended the tunnel, Jason knew that he had easily passed the 10-kilometer threshold, but the tunnel had yet to end. Just how deep underground am I? He thought in frustration, visibly confused about the area he had been forcefully teleported to by the world bridge. Jason's confusion deepened because several minutes passed, and there was still no change in his surroundings. Unable to see anything other than elemental crystals, element ores, beasts that were mostly at the Prisma stages and a cavern hall or underground lake once in a while, nothing around him seemed to change. However, suddenly, 15 minutes after his ascent, his Emperor eyes sighted what he had been looking for a very long time. Finally! Jason shouted, seeing a bright light at the end of the tunnel and the unrestricted energy current swirling through the empty space he'd seen through the soil. Chapter 610 Outside by Hydesgrain. Breaking through the faint membrane of energies that sealed the tunnel from the scorching heat, Jason exclaimed in joy as he emerged on the surface. A faint gust of cool wind brushed against his face that made him smile in relief. He was beyond happy to have finally left the cave. Never could he have expected that his entire journey through the Cave of Elements would end so suddenly. It was truly a miracle, and taking in a deep breath of air, Jason expected a fresh scent to enter his nostrils. However, contrary to his expectations, what he smelled was a reeking stench that almost caused him to vomit. Instinctively, black flames emerged from his body, enveloping Jason's mouth and nose, protecting him from the pungent smell as he forced his eyes to adjust to the bright sun rays. Comparing the sunlight with Argos, he found it to be much brighter, but at the same time, it was more like a soothing feeling instead of a burning hot sensation. As such, Jason felt rather good right now. His body had long since adjusted to the higher gravitational force that had consistently increased the further he ascended. This was scientifically wrong, at least, if he had learned everything on Argos correctly, but Jason could only shrug his shoulders, thinking that mankind had never been able to truly enter other planets with a higher gravitational force. Maybe mana has something to do with the similar gravitational force. Under normal circumstances, I would have been mashed into a pulp of flesh the moment I emerged on mana. Its gravitational force must be more than 10 times higher than on Argos after all. As such, Jason was not sure how exactly gravitational force worked owing to the 3 cultivation energies that were present on mana. The weight of his body had only increased by a small margin after he had arrived on the surface, but that was not really worrisome because his strength had increased much more. Thus, he could easily handle the gravitational force, while the mana consumption of Solaris Black Flame Wings and Mask were almost negligible. Because of that, he could easily take a look around, trying to figure out his surroundings, what kind of beasts the surface harbored, and even more importantly, if there were societies of other races around. Even if entering an unknown society could be dangerous for him as a foreign being, Jason had to figure out where he was, and what the entire situation in his surroundings looked like. Knowing the basic information would only take him further ahead, which was exactly what he was supposed to do right now. However, to his dismay, Jason saw nothing but barren lands and poisonous lakes, which caused his earlier excitement to die down real quick. While taking a deep breath of the filtered air Solaris black flame mask produced, he scratched the back of his head, trying to figure out the direction in which he should fly. However, before that, he let Artemis occupy his mana core by manifesting her white wings, while his physical strength increased further. If a beast were to attack him, Jason wanted to be prepared to fuse with Artemis, and thereby increase his combat prowess as high as possible. Despite Jason's assumptions, he didn't really think that there were many beasts on the surface. Even underground he hadn't come across many beasts, and those he encountered were probably like cockroaches, surviving on everything thrown at them. As such, the number of beasts above the surface was bound to be less owing to the poisonous gas. Thus, those that managed to survive the dangers were likely to be the most annoying for him to face. Looking at the sky, Jason thought of flying at a high altitude, but that was likely to be an even worse choice because he might encounter more beasts there. Sighing deeply, he inserted a large amount of mana into his Emperor eyes, allowing him to see at a distance spanning several kilometers. It was just clear and open sky all around, and there was nothing to obstruct his sight such as the mana-enriched soil underground, thus he could see everything down to the finest detail. There is literally nothing. Scanning his surroundings proved to be a futile effort, and Jason could either waste his time debating with himself or get going. Thus, he decided to let his instincts guide him, which made him choose a direction before he took off. He chose to fly at a low altitude because there were more flying beasts he had sighted than those living on the ground. It was a vast expanse of barren plain stretched across the ground for as far as his eyes could see. In a way, this helped him, because he could see the terrestrial beasts from a safe distance, up in the air without the worry of bumping into them. At least, if one were to ignore beings with a high cultivation base whose eyesight was naturally better than Jason's. However, if he were to be attacked by such beings, he could only curse his misfortune because it was extremely unlikely for individuals at the peak Prisma stage with good eyesight, or maybe even those at the Ascension stage, to attack him. Jason was unable to come up with a valid reason for such beings to attack him as long as he didn't release a tiny trace of his stigma or Celestia aura. Even hunger shouldn't drive them to attack him because he was most likely just a small snack and not nutritious enough to be worth the effort to hunt him. With that in mind, Jason still decided to maintain a safe distance from beasts at the Prisma stage that had at least a few prismarine crystals in their mana core. Unfortunately, that was easier said than done, because he had been oblivious to the fact that there were two more cultivation paths his Emperor eyes had yet to investigate and evaluate properly. Jason's knowledge about the Path of Strength, Prior, was much higher than the Path of Wisdom, Spiral, but that didn't mean he knew how to differentiate the cultivation base of beasts at the Prior stage. Spiral Path beasts have a physical strength that is slightly weaker than common Marist Path beasts, while Prior beasts like Petri are obviously physically affine. However, Spiral Path beasts are much more intelligent, and they seem to be able to survive every kind of scenario. From the looks of it, all spiral cultivators have some sort of psychokinetic ability that increases with their cultivation base, while their vessel is in their mind. As for Prior beasts, they solely rely on their physical strength, and their vessel seems to be their entire body. As such, it is extremely difficult to determine their strength based on what I can see with my Emperor eyes. Only the fluctuations of their primordial energy are a rough indicator, while their life force drops are extremely weird to count. The energy fluctuations are something others can perceive too. Furthermore, I cannot be sure whether it's their entire strength or not because they might be holding back, or concealing some of their primordial energy. To think that my eyes are still lacking. If Jason hadn't been acquiring wrong intel for the last month, the Path of Spiral cultivated in a similar way to the Path of Marist, which was the path of mythic energy, and the one that used mana. The path of spiral was just that one path focused on strengthening the mind, while the other path strengthened the mana one absorbed, allowing one to wield elements and be versatile. The spiritual force, absorbed by those that cultivated in the path of wisdom, would be absorbed, until a certain extent before it would be liquefied too, only to be further compressed into crystals. Thus, Jason, who could see the spirit pool of spiral beasts, was able to roughly gauge their strength. It was by no means perfect, but definitely much easier than trying to figure out the strength of a prior beast according to its drops of life force or primordial energy fluctuations. In the end, the liquefied life force might be a good indicator of a prior beast's strength, but Jason had yet to figure out the ratio of proportion in which the size of a liquefied life force could be related to its strength. If 1 drop of life force is equivalent to 1,000 drops of liquefied mana, a prior beast with 10 life force drops should be at the peak of the lick stage, but why are there so many? Are they not further compressing their life force, or is life force not directly correlated to the cultivation path prior with primordial energy as the cultivation energy? Jason knew that he required much more information to survive in a world with 3 different cultivation energies and many more mysteries. However, in the end, he simply decided to avoid all prior beasts with more than 10 life force drops because it might be a beast he wouldn't be able to cope with. Weirdly enough, the unknown should be something that would instill fear, but Jason felt his entire body thrumming in excitement. Maybe it was not that bad to have been pulled into the world bridge and underground for a month, it might as well be beneficial to me.